So I'll hand over to them just really shortly. But firstly, most of you, all of you really should be part of the Open and Trusting Network. This is something we're putting on specifically for members of the Open and Trusting network. And really, the spirit of Open and Trusting is all about creating space for funders to reflect honestly on your practice, to really share insights across peers and to learn from each other, and really along the way to ask some really fundamental questions about your grant making and about grant making as a whole. And this session is very much in this spirit. So we're looking at the idea of spending out or spending down or time limited philanthropy. So where the foundation really turns the sort of conventional approach to grant making on its head and decides to distribute all its resources and close rather than exist forever. So we've seen this idea really gain in influence and traction across the sector for various motivations, really driven by urgency around issues like climate change, sometimes by questions about fundamental purpose and values, and sometimes by quite practical considerations. So this is not about really telling you how you should approach uh, that question as a foundation, but really it's an invitation to think quite fundamentally about what we do with our assets and the sort of decisions that we make for the long term. Um, and our speakers today have really been closely involved in raising the profile of this issue and helping to surface and form conversations throughout the sector. So we're really happy to have them with us today. Um, so I'll introduce shortly Oliver French or Ollie French. Ollie's been working with a group of funders through an action learning set, which is exploring the practical realities of spending out, and he'll be sharing some of the insights from this work. And then we've got Sally Vivian, who's co-director of Gower Street. Gower Street is a family foundation that made the decision to spend out all its funds before 2030. So really a lived example of doing this in practice. I'll hand over to them in just a moment. We do have time after presentations from Sally and Ollie for some questions. So as you go along, please pop anything that comes to mind in the chat, and we will get to you as many of them as possible afterwards. We're recording today's session, and we'll send a link to everyone afterwards. So without further ado, I'll switch my camera off, and just hand over to Sally and Ollie. Thank you so much.
Hi everybody. I'm going to assume you can hear me all right because we did our tests. Katie, just I think people are still pinging in. If you just keep an eye out for any latecomers, but otherwise I'll just crack on if that's all right. So I'm Oliver. I'm going to talk first, and then Sally. Do you want to introduce yourself now, or do you want to wait until you do your slides, or just a little wait?
I'll just say hi, everyone.
Yeah, so new, old, I mean, I will have met some people, not others. Equal welcome to anyone who is giving us their full attention, and also to all of those who might have the camera off and are scoffing some lunch. Let me sort my screen share out, and then we are good to go. On my presenter layout, sort all that, tech issues. Excellent. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to talk about some insights from a spend down learning community that I've been convening along with Sally for the last kind of 18 months or so, and particularly focus on the insights from a more intensive kind of community of practice that we have been running. I'm going to assume those pings are just people knocking on the door and coming in, so I'll just power through, I think. So if I can find, I will share all links in the chat to the website and the microsite that all this is drawn on. So this one it's too busy for a presentation. I know it's kind of poor Canva PowerPoint practice, but I'll share all of these in a little while. So let me find tech screens. So on the basics, so we found a a lot of different reasons for spending down, spending up, spending in. Some more positive framings are available, which focus on the work being done rather than the institutions itself. And obviously there are other ways to split it. But yeah, I split it into those who are more kind of principles led, with concerns about wealth extraction, accumulation, and concentration. For those who knew me back in my kind of day job before going freelance, which was at Lankelly Chase, that will resonate with some of the reasons behind some of the more famous reasons that might be there that are there for spending out. But there are also a lot of others as well. So there's a few in the group and in the broader field. And I saw some research out today about the number of trusts spending out who are mainly their catalyst is much more practical, much more prosaic. It might be about governance, it might be about boards, it might be about succession plans, it might be about the value of their investments being eaten into by inflation. All those kind of things are there as well. And the big chunk in the middle around mission, which was alluded to a couple of minutes ago. So basically, concentrating funds into a shorter time window as a better way to get things done in the field that people actually want to work in. So it also means I'm not here to talk about kind of like a tight knit or super organized manifesto style movement of time limited philanthropists, but it's more about reflecting on the diverse experiences and insights of a different group of trusts who find themselves in quite similar practical circumstances. So that's not to say that there isn't kind of ambition and shining a light on some corners of philanthropy that isn't happening, but also in preparing for sessions like this and similar ones, I've always been keen to front load the the difference that there is in the group and working across all this kind of stuff. So to go into a little bit more detail, I wouldn't put hard boundaries around any of those. People find out that they might have started off with quite practical reasons, but then they have kind of it's been an eye-opening experience for them and they've developed their rationale along the way, so they can change over time. In terms of raw numbers, like my suspicion, where I'm going off script a bit here, Sally, is that the practically minded are probably the biggest group in the wider sector, especially for smaller trusts and foundations. But I'd see this dialogue as an opportunity to bring them into more kind of intentional practice about what they're doing, and also highlight a bit of the danger or the unintended consequence of just kind of doing your own thing without the kind of ecosystem awareness that we've been looking to build. So I'd say there's kind of something for everyone in there. I don't know exactly who we've got in the room, but something in there will often resonate with everybody. There are a lot of kind of necessary but insufficient conditions for considering spending out in here, whether it's about principles, mission, practicalities, anywhere in between. To move swiftly on some of the more, I'll get to some of the challenges in a minute. So here a ding dong if someone can let them in. Some of the stuff that we've talked about in the group, and like I say, there's a broader community of spend out trusts that we have, but we did a more kind of intensive learning cycle, action learning set, you know the drill, with about 8 of them last year, and that's where a lot of these particular insights are drawn from. So spending up as a kind of liberating, energizing process that makes people feel like they're really getting serious about the work that they want to do, as a reflection of kind of ambition and commitment to what is needed at the minute and the role that they can play. A particularly interesting thing that we'll talk about today is as a kind of a bit of a shortcut to the sort of principles that the open and trusting community espouses, particularly around good practice grant making, flexible, long-term core support, sustainability, eye on the future, proportionality, all of that kind of stuff. And ironically, the way I'd put this is that a lot of spend downs are thinking much more intentionally about the long term than a perpetuity foundation would be with, say, a 3-year strategy. There's a bit of a kind of tension or irony there in terms of who is actually looking towards the sustainability of future impact. Powered up budgets. Obviously, if you're spending your money in a smaller time window, it means being more generous. It means making bigger grants. That's a learning curve in its own right. Sometimes good, sometimes you come crashing back down a little bit. And that kind of ecosystem awareness about who you're funding in common with, what the knock-on effects might be, who your kind of friends, colleagues, and collaborators are out there in the field, whether or not they are time limited. And just a quick note, still a long process. I think there's a tendency to treat spend outs like an event, when in fact they are often quite a long process. You're talking about a decade's work a lot of the time, maybe 8 to 12 years. 5, I'd say, is quick, and some of them are so not slow, but they have such a gentle trajectory that it's perhaps not even really worth bothering talking about just now, and sort of bothering people with. Yes. So other experiences and learning, if my clicker is working. Yeah, the tightrope roller coaster thing, making big grants, getting serious, then not having as much money, and it having a generally kind of intensifying effect on grantee relationships that are there, needing different skills for the kind of takeoff and landing phases, seeing more importance around kind of legacy, ritual endings, those kind of things. It generally, and this can be a positive thing as well, showing how, like, changing how people show up, and what they think their role and purpose might be. Um, Obviously, wobbles, tensions, disentanglements, destabilizing, bit of a tough sell to existing grantees and staff, having been there. Um, yeah, higher stakes, bigger decisions, feeling like it really has to count, being in tension with the kind of letting go aspect of the spend out. Not much of a kind of relate. I would say not no blueprint whatsoever, but not much of a relatable blueprint. Like the ones that get in the news, not everybody is Atlantic Philanthropies or the Gates Foundation. In fact, basically no one is. So it can be kind of alienating sometimes, I think, for smaller trusts to see, oh, you should do this and you should do that. And it's like, we are absolutely nothing like them. But what we have tried to establish is, like the IVAR stuff, a sense of community, peer learning, shared learning, that kind of stuff. Um, and yeah, a few differences between the born versus made ones. Some a time limited from day one intervention might get a different hearing from a trust that's been around for a while that pivots, however, whether suddenly or slowly, to a different strategy. So we'll come back to that's a really whistle stop stuff, and we'll come back to some of the questions after Sally, but the last couple of slides. Lessons and implications for the sector. So I think spend outs will always be pretty small in percentage terms, both numerically and financially, but we've been trying to look at what are the practices and insights they can share with the wider community, spend out or not, hence people being here today. So around demonstrating and incubating different practices, good trendy philanthropy word there, incubate. Around trust-based grant making, around sustainability, around like looking into things like actually funding as gift, thinking about what it means to share power and resources, and what it means to spend more and to spend better. No antagonism there. No one's evangelical about their spend outs at all. But I think they do show what it can look like to really question what a trust's most appropriate and effective role is in the sector, and what constitutes their kind of best effort and their and giving their all. I think that's what's one of the big questions we can ask. And I've got some notes here. And yeah, I go back to the spend more and spend better thing. Um, Avoiding the line of least resistance, and a kind of who blinks first between the values and intentions of a spend down, of a strategic spend down, and the kind of you just get the money out the door imperative, which can be tricky for people. I'll put the link in when I can figure out my screens. I took this screenshot because I had there was a mention for the open and trusting community in the original report that I put out there. But trying to put something or grow that space in the middle between spending more and spending better, and having common cause with good practice and kind of progressive good practice funders in the wider sector. We are doing some of that. I can also share, there's a little graph. There was a report that some people might have seen about a local trust a couple of weeks back, and they had some financial modelling in there, which is good because it looked robust and its statistics and stuff, and people like them, and it came from a bank, so people trust them or whatever. Basically showing how much more money you can spend over a given time frame on a spend out or a spend up trajectory as compared to perpetuity. There are big kind of sort of sizeism issues here where for some trusts the only way to kind of get to the big table and fund big stuff, if only in the short term, is to depreciate capital. And that goes back to one of the earlier slides about the chicken and egg thing, where the existential question of should we or should we not exist is an interesting one, but it's not always the place that people start. I think a better starting point is what is the best distribution of the resources that we hold for the values and intentions that we have. And sometimes like, okay, so kind of climb the ladder a bit. We go, okay, well, we want to make some bigger grants. If we want to make some bigger grants to make bigger impact, then we need to spend more money. If we need to spend more money, then we're going to gradually or quickly depreciate the capital we have. And so it comes at it at a more kind of strategic and intentional question rather than starting off with like, okay, board meeting, item number one, should we or should we not exist? I think that's maybe not always the most useful way to start the conversation. So I've got a few talking points which we'll come back to after Sally's presentation. But thinking about why or if and why perpetuity is the default. And I promised myself I wouldn't say daft stuff like dark matter. I'm gonna stick to that. But are we exposing philanthropy as subservient to wealth management here if perpetuity is the absolute default and assumed thing for everybody? Some people in the group were kind of getting to their best work just at the point where they were then starting to exit the field, and there being some bittersweetness about that, and not wanting the best practices to leave, and hearing that from some of their grantees as well. Obviously in any group and any group of foundations, we're thinking like, oh, is this exposing? Like, am I being asked if we or should or shouldn't do it? It's not that clear or particular, I don't think, but it's kind of ask not whether you should exist, but what you can achieve and enable, or something slightly Kennedy-esque like that. And if we are talking about good practice grant making, there's some maths, or what I'd call like philanthronomics in here. If we're talking about flexible core multi-year funding, it is more expensive. It's a simple mathematical fact that those kind of grants are more expensive. So yeah, for some of the smaller trusts, the only way to afford more of these kind of grants is either to make fewer, or to go with bigger budgets. So yeah. And some of you might also think, I'm glad this is happening, and I'm also glad it's not me, which is not uncommon and perfectly reasonable. So that's a bit of a whistle stop. I think I've just about kept time, but I can stop my screen share now, and I kind of need I'll take a breath, but rather than taking questions now, we thought it would be best if Sally went through her more kind of particular and specific case study experiences of the trusts that you work at, and then we can take questions after, if that's okay with everybody. I can't even see if it's everyone okay, if it's okay until I've stopped sharing, so I'm just gonna have to assume it is. So you're right to step in then, Katie and Sally.
Yeah, just to say thanks, Ollie, and we will save questions to the end, so do pop them in the chat when you think of them, and I'll pass
Yeah,
back
and
to Sally now.
I'll put the link to the site in there as well. There you go. Cool.
Great. Thanks, Ollie. Thanks, Katie. Hopefully you can all see my screen. Ollie, yeah, good. Great. Great to be here with you all. So as Ollie said, I'm mainly going to speak about a bit more specifically about a couple of case studies that I'm involved in before we have a general discussion. But first of all, just to mention a bit more about the group. So the research that Ollie did was based on this action learning set of 8 trusts, which included the 2 I'm going to talk about. But that's part of a wider and growing self-organizing peer support group of trusts who are spending out or thinking about spending out. So I just wanted to flag this. We're now up to 14 or possibly even 15 members, and it's growing by the month, if not the week at the moment. And they represent over 400 million in endowment that's being spent during this decade that otherwise would have been spent over a longer time frame. So it's not huge numbers, but it is significant numbers. And also just to emphasize the variety point that Ollie made. So this is not a uniform grouping. There's a Sainsbury's Trust, a Royal Trust, and there's Lankelly Chase, there's a regranter. There's some very big foundations, some very small ones, a whole range of different focuses. So we're a really eclectic bunch. But we have found that there's a core of shared experiences which is quite substantial, and that we can be helpful to each other just by in terms of sharing experiences. So that group's there. It's open to everyone. Do get in touch with myself or Ollie if it's of interest, or even if this is just something you're thinking about, we're happy to chat to you about it, or you could come along to one of the meetings to sound out a bigger group. So that's that. Now I'm going to talk mainly about Gower Street, which is the trust I'm a co-director of, and I'll also touch on a second trust where I'm trustee and advisor, because they're just to give two contrasting examples of spend out journeys. But to start with Gower Street, so we are a family trust that was started by Nick and Sophie Marple. Essentially, Nick earned, I think, more money than he expected through sports gambling, and was uncomfortable with the fact that proceeds of winning from gambling is not taxed. So he put that money aside to be used philanthropically, and they set up a family trust focused on education in North London and across Africa. And over time, they narrowed the focus in Africa to Ghana, where they had connections, and started working with smaller organisations with the idea that they could hopefully have a greater impact by focusing in one place. And around about 2017, 2018, they had a bit of awakening around climate change. I think the way Sophie puts it is they'd kind of pushed it away, not wanted to think about it, but went through a learning process and faced into climate change and decided actually that would be the best use of their philanthropic spending. Nick was also stopping working at the time, so there wasn't more money to go in. There was a pot of 8 million. So it was what to do with that. So they decided to refocus on climate change and to make it a spend out. And that was linked to the 2020s being seen as the critical decade for climate action. All of the political goals around trying to limit warming to 1.5 degrees are all by 2030, based around this decade. So that was kind of a trigger to set the timeline and set the spend out. The board was due a refresh, so they took on climate expertise and Ghanaians onto the board, and they had just kind of bits and bobs of freelance professional support before, but they recruited myself and Tessa Durham as co-directors, and we both work 3 days a week, so we're just over one person. So we were taken on to deliver the spend out basically, and that's what we've been doing. Still with the focus of Ghana and the UK. And it's gone very fast. Our spend out pattern is very much a bell curve. So we really accelerated getting money out the door and peaked around 23, 24. And we've had to bring the date of the spend out or date of closure earlier to 2028 because of the rate we've been spending at. And it's, in fact, most funding decisions, if not all funding decisions, will be made by the end of this year. And then because it's multi-year giving, that money will continue to go out the door up to 2028. And we tend to support early stage organisations with multi-year core or unrestricted funding, with the ideal model being that by the time we've finished working with them, they're graduating onto bigger and more diverse funders. Sometimes that takes longer, sometimes that takes less time, and we try and design our grant making around it. Basically, we're very relationship focused and responsive to the individual partners that we work with, and that's I think that ethos of relationship focus has been there throughout Gower Street's life, but the ability to give on a bigger level for more years has come about because of the spend out, and to give to a bigger groups, bigger numbers of grantees in the UK and Ghana. And that's really relevant now as we get near the end of the spend out, because a lot of our focus now is on capacity building, for want of a better term, and networking partners with each other and encouraging collaborations where they are productive. So kind of strengthening partners by joining them and sharing knowledge and building the field. And we've got 60 partners, so we can do that meaningfully, and we wouldn't have been able to if we were not a spend out and we were supporting smaller numbers at smaller levels of grants. So I think just the other reflection there is that in our spend out journey, our jobs have really changed. They're really changing right now, from being kind of quite a rapid grant maker, really focused on getting that money out the door, but responsibly to effective partners, to now being much more of a advocate, network builder, capacity builder, and as far as possible, kind of sharing the wisdom and the learning between our grantees. So that's Gower Street. I will obviously answer any questions on it. I'll just touch more briefly on the Castle Trust, which is another trust which is part of the group. I'm a trustee of and an advisor to this trust. And it's just to contrast it with Gower Street, really. So Castle Trust was 100 years old when it decided to spend out. And it was again, it was an education trust. It was a very large trust. When it was founded, it had the equivalent of 30 million pound, about 33 million pounds. By the time we decided to spend out, we had just £1.5 million left in the pot. So it had really kind of eroded over the 20th century. It had made some quite big investments in the education system in the first half of the 20th century, and then focused on support for Commonwealth scholars in the second half. And then when I came on board in 2011-ish, we were looking to give money overseas, with a view that that would have a bigger impact with a smaller budget. But the decision to actually finally spend out came when our vice chair, who was related to the founder by several generations gap, put it on the table as an option, basically. And I think the truth is, as trustees, it just hadn't even occurred to us that it was an option. So her putting it out there made us realize it was, and also gave us permission to consider it, because she had that kind of authority of someone linked to the founder and entitled to interpret what his views would have been, if you see what I mean. So we did decide to spend out. And the other really influential factor was that at the time there had been quite reliable sources of multi-year grants for girls' education. So from Comic Relief and Lottery and DFID, and all of those had closed. So we realised we were helping in a very small way large numbers of charities that were really struggling. But actually, if we spent out, we could do 3 or 4 really chunky, meaningful grants that would help them kind of strengthen through that difficult patch. And that's what has been done, and it's worked quite successfully. So again, it was a bell. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. So again, it's been a bell curve of spending, with an even steeper trajectory than Gower Street. And as we come to the end, we're closing this summer now, the Castle Trust. Our final grant is for a longitudinal study of girls' education, and that's an interesting one because it goes beyond the end. In fact, it goes to 2029. So we won't have any capacity to oversee it. So what we've actually done is we've come up with a tag team arrangement with Gower Street, where Gower Street will administer that grant until they close, and then the final bit will just be done independently. So I think one of the interesting challenges around spending out is that kind of switching mode, as I touched on before, how your jobs change, but also working out the endings and the loose endings, because you, as Ollie has said, you often find on a spend out journey, you've got the opportunity to do your best work, your best grant making. But that doesn't necessarily lead itself to very neat timelines and boxing off of things. So that's kind of just an interesting area of working in a spend out. Not sure how I think we're okay for time. I'm only going to speak to one point on this slide. So there's going to be a book coming out towards the end of this year with Agenda Publishing on spending out, and it's going to feature 10 case study stories from the group. And then I've kind of woven it together with some analytical chapters. So that will be open access, free to everybody. Hopefully it will be an interesting resource to anyone thinking about this. And this is just some kind of themes and structure from the book, which are very similar to Ollie's. So the only thing I'm just going to pull out as something that feels quite, if not distinctive, but is really kind of brought out by the spend out experience and isn't necessarily open and trusting, but is of interest, is the ecosystem approach. So I think something we have all realised as we've gone is the importance and the value of looking externally to where you sit as a funder in the broader ecosystem of philanthropy and thinking about what your most effective role could be in that system. So just to think of like a very oversimplified example, say you are a homelessness funder. Are you kind of a big anchor funder that is needed in that space for the long term that others kind of rely on and turn to? Or are you a smaller, scrappy funder that could perhaps have a much greater impact, really strengthen some great grantee organisations and bring some other funding into the space if you chose to use your resources to spend out in the shorter term? So I think that's just a point that we've not all of us thought about before we decided to spend out, but we've all realised whilst we're spending out the value in kind of looking beyond our own organisational boundaries and thinking about where we fit in a funding ecosystem. And I think that's good practice. So it's a benefit of spending out. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is just talk a little bit about how spending out links to or resonates with open and trusting principles. And there's a quote there from Sarah Ridley, who some of you might know ran the Tubney Trust, which spent out, and she wrote a really useful book long report that we've all found very, very useful, and she's incredibly generous with her time and wisdom. But she's making the essential point that funders can have a tendency to be a bit controlling. But once you make that decision to spend out, there's just this fundamental shift to having to trust your grantees more, because you are not the people who are going to be here trying to deliver impact and change over time. They are the agents of change that will go on after you. And your role is to invest in them as best you can to enable them to do that. So I do think spending out does drive that fundamental shift towards being more trusting. Linked to that, to having a higher appetite for risk and being more flexible with your funds, because you can't address things in the next grant cycle, or if you get it wrong, you can go to other grantees. You know, these are the bets you're placing. So you want to give them as best as possible a chance of success and acknowledge that you won't necessarily be here to see whether it succeeds or fails in a formal capacity. So there is a strong alignment with more open and trusting grant making. And I think what we have found is that wherever you start, you shift. So Gower Street's always been a very flexible open core funder, but we've moved another step on, and we've now invested, a lot of trust and a lot of just belief into our partners. Castle Trust was a much more traditional, restrictive, project by project, checking the outcomes and the budget lines funder. And we shifted, not to where Gower Street already was, but a big move from where we were to a place where we were giving these big multi-year grants that were very flexible. The projects happened through COVID, so they all changed beyond recognition. The timelines changed. And we just put more on trust, and we put more into the relationship and into flexibility. So I think, and the other open and trusting principle just to flag is communication, because as spend outs, we've all become more alert to how we communicate, particularly around the decision to spend out, because it can take quite a long time and clear and repeated comms to get that message to sink in that you are going to be exiting and when that's going to be. Because, you're often exiting a partnership because you're spending out, not because of anything they've done. So it's really, it's extra important to make sure people realise and can plan around that, and then that is linked to kind of just more clear communication in general, I would say. But having said this, and I think Ollie said, lots of us who are spending out feel it has led to us doing our best work, which is brilliant. But there is a bit of a dark side, a bit of an undercurrent as well when it comes to open and trusting practice and spending out. Because, as I said before, these partners you're giving to, they're your bets for change. So, yes, you trust them more. Yes, you're more flexible, but they're also your only chance to get it right. So there can be this tendency to be actually more controlling, and kind of try and have greater ownership over what they're doing and hold them tighter in a not good way. So I think that's something that we all have to remain alert to with our boards and with ourselves, in how we practice good grant management and relationship management. And also in terms of openness. So certainly at Gower Street and at Castle Trust, actually, it was really an important point of principle for us that we did accept unsolicited approaches, so that there was a channel to come to us. It wasn't just based on our own networking and referrals. But again, that becomes really hard as you get nearer to spending out, because there's less and less that you can take on, because the resources are declining and they're often tied up in longer term commitments or partners that you've been with on a long journey, and you want to end the journey with them. So again, that's just another tension which is tricky to manage, particularly towards the end of the spend out. When you start with very good intentions and open processes, then at some point you have to narrow that down, and it is tricky. So that's everything I want to say. Here's a list of selected readings, which I'm happy to share if anyone is interested. I've got a much longer list, but these are the ones that I've found particularly useful, and something that lots of people who join the group say or have said until recently is that there's nothing out there. They feel alone. They've mainly found Sarah's report on Tubney, which is great, but nothing else. But writing this book, I've spent a lot of time finding a lot of reading, so I'm very happy to share any that are of interest. So I'll stop there, and I think we can go to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sally and Ollie. Just really candid and interesting and illuminating, both on the sort of the overall sort of things that can inform and kind of get in the way of spending out, but also just that deep dive into two experiences. So thank you so much. We have a few questions on the chat. Do send more when they come to you. Oh, hi, Elaine. You have the option. I mean, I was going to field questions, but you can also ask them direct if you'd like to. I was going to ask Elaine, did you want to ask your question directly?
Hello, yeah, I'm happy to do that. Let me just go and find it. I was interested in the conclusion of the relationship, and whilst I understand that grant holders will be going in understanding that it is a spend out funding scheme, I just wondered if there have been any kind of particular challenges that have cropped up for the grant holders of any of the spent out funds involved in this action learning group. And I guess the funder, if the funders have an approach to, I guess, ending the relationship in the most stabilizing way for the grantee, kind of, trying to make them as resilient as possible when the funding stops. Is that something that's built into the design of spend out funds?
Shall I start, Ollie? Yeah, it's a really good question, and it definitely is a huge consideration. and it's something that ideally would be considered right from the beginning. Um, and it isn't always. And I think that's one of the learnings is that if people are thinking about spending out or any time limited giving is kind of having that conversation with the grantee right from the start so everybody can plan. So at Gower Street, as I said, our model is typically multi-year early stage funding. With a clear plan for organisational development and diversification of funding by the end of the relationship. And sometimes we've extended that. And in other spend outs and in Gower Street, some partnerships have led to kind of bigger legacy grants or final grants, which are sometimes investments, like bigger investments in the organisations that will help them be more sustained. So there's like the classic investing in a capital project, but if you look at the Foyle Foundation, their website, they've done some kind of really big impacts, legacy pieces around endowing organisations, longer term programming. So a lot of thought goes into it, a lot of investment goes into it. And the other thing is, with the exception of some of those big legacy grants, generally the grant making in our group still sticks to that principle of not making a partner overly dependent on you, so limiting the proportion of their income that your grant it represents, so that in theory they should be able to be sustainable just as they would with the ending of any other multi-year grant. And it's sometimes a bit sad for us, but it's sometimes the best case scenario where our funding doesn't really feel any different to them to any other multi-year funder because, they're sensibly diversifying, growing their income. Having said that, like, as we all know, it's such a tough time. It is such a tough time. And some ways, it feels awful to be leaving partners at such a tough time, but you have to look on it as in, well, we couldn't have done this 5 years really good funding if we hadn't been a spend out, but we have, and we've done everything we can to set them up well to go forward.
Can I ask a wee follow-up to that?
Sure.
Just in terms of the nature of the funding, in terms of some of it may be for a specific project, for very focused impact, and in terms of some of the funded organisations, would there be proportions that are maybe unrestricted or for capacity building in the organisation, or even for kind of investing in the organisation, so that actually as a result of that 5 year kind of funding, they've been able to kind of, I guess, strengthen, it could be even something like the income potential of that organisation, so that you're not just funding a project or a piece of learning that has wider impact, but you're potentially contributing to a kind of an even more resilient organisation, which goes on to then have impact.
Yeah. So there's a huge variety of different ways that is being done by spend out trusts. Just to stick to Gower Street, I think a couple of the things we've done, which are pretty simple, but our partners have found most useful, is one, when we've given, so all of our funding is core or unrestricted. And it was traditionally kind of linked to 2 or 3 year time frame. But with our final grants, our legacy grants, we have given an amount without a timeline. So we've said, this is the last grant. We'd say this is 100K. It's the last grant we can give you. You tell us if you want to have it all this year or draw it down over 2 or 3 years. And also we keep that under review. So that I know partners have found that useful, and they've all done different things. But that's enabled them to kind of bridge tricky patches or get match funding for other multi-year funding by spreading it out. They've all done different things. So just that flex has been really helpful. And another thing we've done, as I said, we've done a lot of capacity building where we've put together offers or where we've funded specific things. But with some partners, we've also given them a flexible capacity building budget that they can draw down again over a number of years, but in whatever pattern they want and for whatever they want, essentially. So they haven't had to think about it 3 years ahead of time. As their organisation has developed, they've been able to identify, oh, right, we really need some digital skills training now, or we really need this bit of software, or whatever it is. So they've had that kind of long-term pot to be able to draw from. And that's been really effective as well. But there are Ollie, you're
Yeah,
off
I was
mute.
just going to add something there, and I know there's a couple of questions in the chat that we'll need to get to as well, Katie. I've put there's an article in there that I used in the spend out group around whether funding can make grantees less dependent on funding. Like it's a really, really tough question, and it sounds a bit defensive. I'd say, like about the standards that we hold spend out philanthropy to compared with everyday normal philanthropy. Like good practice is still the same thing, really, in terms of thinking about sustainability, thinking about different types of impact, thinking about relationships, thinking about approach. They're not, you know, there's not much of this sounds really weird because I'm here to talk about spend out philanthropy, but not all of it is particular to actually not much of it is particular to spend out philanthropy in terms of the practices and the choices. We'll get onto it in a minute. The question of whether to kind of distribute or concentrate funds is one that all foundations are making anyway. The question about how to look after grantees and think about their future sustainability is one that foundations are asking anyway. I think there's the question of it, spending down as a catalyst to make your very best effort in all of these areas, and whether it's at the end or during the spend out phase. Like transition funding is very common. It sounds a bit crass to say like parachute funding and things like that, but there certainly is some of that, and a desire to do right by grantees both during and towards the end of spend out phases. Though we've only actually had, I think, one kind of complete during their time with the group so far, and all of this may be ahead for them. I don't know whether that's a segue into a couple of the questions in the chat as well, or if that's I don't know what
Yeah,
you're
thank you,
thinking.
Elaine.
Yeah.
Thanks both. Well, I mean, Lauren had a question about just, yeah, if there's any evidence around how to maximize impact in terms of the decisions you make of how you divest your funds. So she
Mm.
suggests, through endowments to charities versus one single focus area or any other lesser known models out there.
Should I try this one first, Sally? Yeah. Well, I don't want to do that. Like, oh, look at the website thing. So you'll find some of this stuff there's a strategy section and there's a intentions and impact section in the microsite. And I think what someone said in the group was like sort of tying myself in knots here, but like spend out philanthropy is philanthropy. It's the same again. The quick question is there some big comparative analysis of different spend out rationales and whether and their different levels of impact in their fields compared to one another? No. But even within a small group of trusts, are people employing loads of different strategies and spending trajectories? Yes. So there'll be all kinds of graphs and stuff in there, some of that kind of bell curve sombrero shape, some of the kind of ski jump of the final hurrah, some of them are a kind of gradual uptick in spending. They will all be up to the individual foundation as to what they think, what their board thinks, maybe even what their grantees think is the most effective distribution of resources for the task at hand. And some of them are doing kind of just one thing, some of them have kind of twin approaches. I think Joffrey Trust is a bit twin, where they have kind of one very niche and specific thematic approach around illicit finance, but then they also have one of their other strategies around kind of high potential and high impact nonprofits. But it's that, is there a specific blueprint of what kind of grant making to do other than a way to spend more money? I would say no, not really. But there are a variety of trajectories and strategies in play. Is that fair, Sally? Is that a bit kind of equivocal? I don't know. But yeah, I did everyone's grants trajectories and they were all different. I think a couple of them were similar. You could see that, okay, here's where things are really kicking off. Like your median grant has gone bananas. This is like, this represents you investing very heavily. in fewer partnerships, but a couple of the others are spreading funds more widely. And also, I think if you look at the old Tubney report, they had a very kind of partnership based and strategic, like betting big on a few partners in particular fields, particularly around farming and animal welfare, I think. Anything to add there, Sally?
No, I agree with all of that. I suppose two things. One is that we're not really talking about more radically different models. So Lankelly Chase obviously is considering a redistribution and doing it differently. And then, in the book we look at a few like aligned traditions which aren't about trusts, like the Good Ancestor movement, which are more about wealth management. But talking within trusts that have decided to spend out, yeah, as Ollie said and Elaine has said, it's still just philanthropy and how to do it well. I think that the qualitative difference is it does feel like there is a spend out mindset that kind of frees you up and makes you just think much more about the best way, or more about the best way of doing things, because it's your only chance. But there are probably exercises you can do within perpetuity trusts that help you think in that way. So doing like Boardroom 2030 or an obituary process where you think about, in theory, if we were closing in 10 years, what would we want to look back on and see our impact is? Like there are probably other ways of triggering that. Well, I don't know, maybe there are ways of triggering that mindset shift. I think that's an interesting thing to think about.
Brilliant, thanks both. And then just in terms of another stakeholder, which is like staff, if you have a foundation that is staffed, I mean, how do you decide, or who generally takes the decision to go down a spending out route, and what's the process and how do you communicate that with staff, and how do you, on a practical level, keep staff employed for you while when they know that you're going to be sort of shutting your doors at some finite point in the future?
Me or you first, Sally? What do you think?
I can do that quickly. I don't think that, and then come to you, Ollie. I don't think there is again, there's a typical as to who makes the decision. I mean, obviously, it's a board sign-off thing, and it often originates from the board, and it often originates from a founder or a family member if it's a family trust, but not always. Depending on the nature of the trust, that might have been nudged along significantly by the CEO or the staff. In our group, there are quite a few one-man bands where the CEO or director is a really key stakeholder. But there are also examples where this is done to staff, and that is definitely rather than in consultation with staff or staff having been recruited to deliver a spend out, and that's obviously harder, like with any big change in an organisation. One of the really helpful things we've done in the group is just compare notes on staff retention and redundancy policies. And again, they're all very different. They're all very tailored to the individuals. But in general, trusts boards have thought quite carefully about how to retain staff, and they often do want to retain the same staff, sometimes take on some specialists, but they often want to have the same people see a whole process out as the lowest cost and highest value way of doing it in their eyes. So that's a mix of encouraging staff to stay by investing in them, investing in helping them train for their next job, but also compensating them so that because they are going to be made redundant. So it's a mix of enhanced benefits and packages. But something that's really lovely about it, and the person who ran the Marva Foundation told us about this, is that you get to, if you manage it right, you get to genuinely and openly help each other plan for their next step in their career and support that and encourage that. And that's often not the case. Just, people have to quietly do interviews and slope off. So that it can create a really lovely openness that isn't always there. Ollie, anything to add?
Yeah, I can, and I'll weave in Hannah's. Oh, hi, Hannah. I'll weave in Hannah's question as well about kind of grantees, just as it's a bit of a broad thing to say, but it's an intriguing phenomenon that, as far as I can see it, there's very little upward pressure, let's say, for spend outs and funder closures, but there is a huge amount of sorry, that's my cat. There's a huge amount of upward pressure for a lot of the ingredients that we've talked about that might result in them. Okay, so if you, like the bigger grants, like the bigger ambition, like the less hoarding, like all of those things, the logical result of some of those things is foundation spending more of their money and depreciating their capital. So it's oh, seriously. Get down. Come on, sweetheart. Sorry. This is being recorded, isn't it? Christ. Uh,
Adding a
um
lot of value, I'd say.
yes, sorry. I'm a professional. It like, and it's in the comms section in the microsite as well. It is a tough sell. I think it's like, if you get a letter from your broadband provider or your water company, and there's like 2 pages of text on their investment in the network and so on, and it's like skip, skip, skip. Like, what's the bill at the end? Like, is this something that impacts me financially? Is this something that impacts the agreements that we've already got, or any more that we might have in future? And that's not a question of sort of selfishness or anything. It's completely understandable for a very, very hardly, like, thinly stretched charity sector, and it's also why a lot of the spend out foundations were struggling with their comms, because no matter how much they tried to talk about the positives, it's like, okay, we're going to try harder, we're going to do bigger grants, we're going to do more money, we're going to do more mission focused, and then lots of their grantees' responses is like, oh no. And that's really jarring for people, and I think it reflects a broader sense of kind of precarity, scarcity in the sector at large, when it's like, oh God, not another funder strategy review. Like, see, grant seekers and fundraisers aren't huge fans, especially if there's a practical option to limit the access of funds to existing grantees, or to use proactive methods. And I don't have loads to add with Sally. I won't really say much kind of confidential or controversial, but and also, especially in places like this, it's easy to get lulled into thinking that most trusts have big staff teams and strategy people and comms people and so on, but most of the foundation sector is pretty light on the HR, and we're usually not talking about, I mean, I am personally perhaps an exception. We're not really talking about the disbanding of large staff teams and career breaks and things. We're talking about board-led decisions, and not a huge kind of like impact radius in terms of the people and their jobs. But yeah, of course we would say, and this isn't a hard sell for the group that we have or anything, because it's only spend outs in it anyway. But yeah, people chat about that stuff, about redundancy policies, about looking after people, about runways, about retention, about keeping people motivated, and how to do it as a kind of, blaze of glory versus lame duck thing, when it's like, okay, this is ending, and it really does change how people show up and the kind of incentives and power that you have, even as you're spending more money. So yeah, that's what I think on that one, if that helps. I don't know if there are any other questions that have popped up that we have time for, or if everyone is either off for their lunch or has been secretly scoffing
I
at it.
think
I'm
I
not sure.
think we've got 1 minute left, so probably just in the interest of our sort of discipline, I should round it off. But thank you so much for all of those insights. I mean, it got a really nice comment from Rosie Phillips in the chat. Just, even if you're
Thanks,
actually
Rosie.
not thinking about spending out, this is a really good reminder of how to think about your practices and how to be really intentional with what you do. But I hope for anybody who sort of this has sparked a sort of, an interest in taking this conversation further. This has been a really good starting point, and it sounds like there's so much resource that you can pull on, both in terms of the groups, the microsite, and the upcoming book, which will be really, really useful. We'll also be sharing this conversation further as well, so you can pass it on to people within and outside your organizations. But just thank you all so much for coming, for spending your lunch with us, and thank you so much for Sally and Oliver for sharing all your insights as well.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you.